Building a cedar strip canoe has been a long-term goal of mine, and in 2025 I decided it was time to make a start on this daunting project. I began by reading lots of books, blog posts, online forums, and watching many YouTube videos. Nick Shade and Ted Moore's books and online resources are essential, but I'm also grateful to the many other builders and content creators out there who are happy to share their knowledge and experience. I came back to these resources countless times over the course of the build. The first step is to decide on a design and obtain plans. I bought plans for a Freedom 15 canoe from Guillemot Kayaks. This is a 4.5 metre canoe suitable for beginner and average paddlers and use on lakes and rivers. I traced the plans onto 2 sheets of 12mm plywood and cut out the station moulds. I then started on the strongback, which would support the canoe during the build. The next step was to make the stems by steam bending thin strips of Victoria ash. I snapped the wood on my first 2 attempts, but eventually got the technique right. Australian hardwoods behave very differently to North American woods. After clamping for 24 hours and then leaving for a week to dry, I glued the strips together with epoxy and then put them aside for later in the build. The hull of the canoe is formed from strips of western red cedar with ash and jarrah accent strips. Here I'm milling the strips from 140 by 17mm boards, 5.4 meters long. I wanted to keep the face grain pattern, so I first cut 21mm blanks and resawed into 6mm strips. The strips got a bead routed on one side and a cove on the other, flipping the boards end to end to keep the same reference face. The bead and cove ensure that the strips fit nicely together following the curve of the hull without leaving any gaps. I made several test cuts to get the position of the router bit just right. Milling the strips took the better part of a day. I ended up with 72 strips in total. My rough calculation was that I passed over 2 kilometers worth of wood through the table saw and router that day to mill the strips. They got wrapped into bundles from the same board, ready for the next step. With the strips milled, I could attach the mould stations to the strongback, which I'd been using as a second workbench up till now. Marks on the strongback and a string line ensure correct spacing and alignment of the moulds. This is the first time you get to see the shape of the full-size canoe. I sharpened my block plane blade in preparation for tapering the lower part of the inner stems. Further shaping will happen after placing the first few strips. A spare strip is used as a batten to get the correct angle. We're now about 2 months in and I'm ready to place the first strip. I find the center by balancing the strip on my finger and aligning this with the center mold station. The strip is held in place temporarily using brackets. This strip will form the shear line of the canoe. After checking it's placed correctly, I staple it to the mold station. Successive strips are then placed by running a glue line in the cove of the previous strip and then placing the next strip bead edge down, holding with clamps and stapling to the mold stations. I alternate sides of the canoe every couple of strips. This was the most fun part of the build as I got to see the canoe take shape. The jarrah accent strips were too hard for the staples, so I used brad nails to hold them in place. These dental syringes hold just the right amount of glue for one strip. Since the cove is facing upwards, you need to protect the delicate edges by placing dowels or off-cut strips in the cove when applying downward clamping pressure on the strip. The end of each strip is trimmed to length after the glue has dried to make space for the next strip from the opposite side. As I got further up the hole, I needed to get creative with clamping. I used everything from masking tape to bungee cords. In the end, I found that placing old bicycle tubes over spring clamps worked best. At some point you can no longer place strips from both sides of the canoe. You then fill in the hole from one side, trim down the center line, and then painstakingly fit strips from the other side. You can see how much flex there is in the strips. I had to use a heat gun to pre-bend the last few strips before fitting. The final strip that closes the hull is called the whiskey strip and is well deserving of a celebration. I then chisel into my beautifully completed hull to attach the outer stems. These are epoxied to the inner stems and temporarily secured with screws. Once the epoxy has dried, I remove the screws and plug the holes. Finally, I shape the outer stems. I could now pull the staples that were temporarily holding the strips to the mold stations while the glue dried. Some broke and I had to remove them from underneath by lifting the boat slightly or digging into the hole with a pair of long-nose pliers before sanding. Ah yes, sanding. It now begins and there will be a lot more of it. I fed the hole with 80 grit and then sanded down smooth to 120 grit. Any gaps between strips were filled with wood filler. The weather turned cold and my shed is not heated, so I had to delay fiberglassing the hull until after winter. I decided to turn my attention to making the paddles, yoke and seats. The paddles are made from ash with jarrah accent strips to match the canoe. They are shaped with a hand plane and spoke shave and receive 3 coats of varnish after sanding to 220 grit. The yoke or thwart is a brace that is placed across the middle of the canoe. It acts to hold the canoe's width and allows you to carry the canoe upside down on your shoulders. I use a spoke shave to carve a comfortable shape. The seat frames were made from 22 by 40 mm ash and assembled with hand-cut mortise and tenon joinery. I drilled and countersunk holes for the weaving and applied 3 coats of varnish. Hannah and I spent the next 2 weeks weaving the seats, sometimes with a little help from the dogs. We used 2.5 mm synthetic rattan cane. 4.8 mm holes were drilled 16 mm apart. It looks complicated, but is actually quite straightforward once you know what you're doing. They came out looking great. Spring arrived and it was time to get back to working on the canoe. I filled remaining gaps in the hull and did an orbital sand at 120 grit, then wet down to raise the grain and did a final hand sand. The canoe was then wiped clean and taken outside for fiberglassing. I couldn't obtain wide enough fiber cloth in Australia, so I had to overlap 2 sheets of fiberglass to cover the hole. The seam is hardly visible in the final product. Start by rolling out the fiberglass cloth and brushing out any wrinkles. Then it was time to apply the epoxy. I used boat coat, 2 pumps of resin and 1 pump of hardener. Stir for 2 minutes and then apply. I was a bit nervous about this step, but Chris and Hannah were a great help and made the process a lot less stressful. The first coat took about 2 hours but ended up looking great. I waited 2 to 3 hours between coats and applied 3 more filler coats, cutting the excess fiberglass cloth between the first and second coat. The subsequent coats were much easier because you don't have to worry about creases or bubbles in the cloth. Even so, I worked until well after midnight to get the last coat complete. A few days later, after the epoxy had time to cure, I fixed a few difficult spots, mostly around the stems. I also sanded the hull with a fairing board to remove high spots and then applied another filler coat of epoxy, not shown in the video. It was then time to fair the hull, sand it uniformly to 120 grit, and flip the canoe ready to work on the inside. Sanding was a lot of work. The aim is to get a uniform white appearance, which tells you that there are no high or low spots. Don't worry, the glossy wood appearance will come back after varnish is applied. Once again, I removed high spots and sanded smooth, starting at 140 grit, then 80 grit, then 120 grit. It's much harder sanding the inside of the canoe, but also less important since it's not as visible. I felt more confident applying the fiberglass and epoxy to the inside. Once again, Hannah was a great help, and the rest of the family came out to lend a hand too, leaving me to focus on the difficult bits around the inner stems. They turned out a mess and needed to be fixed with a reinforcement strip and detailed filing and sanding. I applied 3 filler coats of epoxy to the inner hull. There were a lot more drips and sags than when epoxying the outer hull, but they were easily fixed using a card scraper. As with the outer hull, I sanded the inside to a uniform white color with 120 grit sandpaper and cleaned up all the epoxy dust with a wet rag. The next stage was preparing the trim, also called the gunnels. I didn't have long enough planks of ash, so I had to scarf joint two shorter lengths together. One of the scarf joints failed after installation. I repaired it in place with thickened epoxy, and it has held up well ever since. I decided I wanted scuppers on the inner gunnels. I measured these at 120mm with 120mm gaps, which gave the right spacing for attaching the seats. I left a 240mm section in the middle for supporting the yoke. The scuppers were routed to a depth of 6mm with a dish cutting bit in several shallow passes. Disaster struck again when I went to fit the inwales. One broke and I had to remake them from scratch off camera. Anyway, the additional effort was worth it. The scuppers look fantastic. After cutting to length, I tapered the ends, rounded over the bottom and glued in place with thickened epoxy. As the saying goes, you can never have too many clamps. With the gunnels installed, it was time to make the decks. I glued together pieces of jarrah cut along the diagonal and inserted an ash accent strip to blend in with the rest of the canoe. I used a special router glue bit, making the joint super strong. Once cured, I fitted and shaped the decks using a string line to ensure that the accent strip stayed centered. I also routed a finger hold on the underside to make carrying the canoe easier. The decks were epoxied in place and held with 3 stainless steel screws from either side. These were later covered with jarrah plugs. I then sanded the decks and gunnels flush with the top of the hull. Installing the yoke and seats required cutting to the correct length and drilling through the inner gunnels. I spent a long time measuring, calculating and double checking before cutting the seat frames. Here we go. The seats fit perfectly and look great in the canoe. The last step was to varnish the canoe. I removed the seats and yoke so they wouldn't get in the way. A seal coat of epoxy was applied to the decks and gunnels, not shown. Varnishing was done in 3 sections. First the trim and under the decks. Second the inside of the hull. And third the outside of the hull. I used Micro Shield Marine Spar varnish and applied 4 coats to the trim and 3 coats to the inner and outer hull, with light sanding between coats. The finish wasn't perfect, but I'll have another chance next year when I have to reapply the varnish. It was a relief to do the final installation of the seats and yoke. I cut ash spacers to keep the seats at the right depth when hung from the gunnels. The canoe was ready to launch. We picked a miserable day, but everyone still had fun. All up, I spent about 400 hours and 14 months actively working on the canoe, and even more hours researching and thinking about it. The cost was about 5,000 Australian dollars, including materials, consumables, and equipment that I didn't already own. Despite the poor weather on launch day, I'm thrilled with the end result, and I'm looking forward to putting many scratches on the canoe in the years to come.